This is Strides to Solutions. I am your host, Esther Adams. There is a pattern that shows up constantly in how people talk about their own pasts, and it does not make much logical sense on the surface. Someone will describe a period of their life in genuinely negative terms: a demanding job that left them exhausted, a relationship that was difficult more often than it was good, a stretch of caregiving or illness or upheaval that they would never describe in the moment as something they were enjoying. And then, months or years later, that same person will say they miss it. Not miss it in some ironic or joking way, but genuinely, with a kind of ache that seems to contradict everything they said about the period while they were living through it. This is common enough that it deserves a real explanation rather than a shrug, and the research on memory, identity, and nostalgia gives us several genuinely distinct mechanisms that, together, account for it far better than any single idea could on its own. The easy explanation, the one most people reach for first, is that memory is simply unreliable. That time sands down the sharp edges of a hard period until only a soft, flattering version remains. There is real truth buried in that intuition, but stated that simply it undersells what is actually happening, because it treats memory as a passive process that just gets worse at holding on to detail over time, the way an old photograph fades. The research paints a much more active picture. Memory is not failing to hold on to the negative parts of a hard period. It is actively reorganizing what it holds for identifiable reasons, and understanding those reasons is what actually explains the missing. The first mechanism worth examining closely is something researchers call the fading affect bias, and it is one of the more robust, well replicated findings in the entire literature on autobiographical memory. The basic finding is simple to state: when people recall past events, the negative emotion attached to unpleasant memories tends to fade faster over time than the positive emotion attached to pleasant memories. This is not a subtle statistical trend visible only in large data sets. It shows up reliably across many different methods of studying memory, across different cultures, and across different populations, which is part of why researchers consider it a genuinely robust psychological phenomenon rather than a curiosity of any one study design. Practically, this means that two memories which originally carried roughly similar emotional weight, one positive and one negative, do not stay emotionally matched over time. The negative one loses its sting faster than the positive one loses its glow, and the gap between them widens the longer ago the event occurred. This bias appears to function as a form of emotion regulation, something the mind does on purpose, in a sense, rather than a flaw in how memory works. It is associated with better psychological outcomes, tracking positively with self esteem and general positive affect, and tracking negatively with psychological distress, which suggests it is doing real adaptive work rather than simply distorting the past for no functional reason. Interestingly, the strength of this bias is not fixed. It appears to grow stronger with age, which fits with a broader pattern researchers have found in how emotional priorities shift across the lifespan, where older adults increasingly prioritize emotional regulation and positive experience over other goals. But the bias is also fragile in specific, informative ways. People experiencing dysphoria, meaning a persistent low mood that falls short of full clinical depression, show a measurably weaker version of this effect, with their negative memories staying closer to full emotional intensity rather than softening over time. Adolescents identified as being at high clinical risk for developing an affective disorder show the same pattern: a blunted fading effect and more vivid recall of negative material specifically. This tells us something important. The fading of negative emotion in memory is not an automatic mechanical process that happens to everyone equally. It is closer to a healthy default setting, one that can be disrupted by depression, trauma, or heightened psychological vulnerability, which also explains why some people genuinely do not experience this softening and instead remain stuck with the full emotional weight of a difficult period long after it has ended. So the fading affect bias gives us one solid piece of the puzzle. The pain of a hard chapter genuinely does soften faster in memory than whatever was good about it. But this alone does not fully explain the specific, active longing that people describe. Fading pain would predict something closer to emotional neutrality about the past, a gradual erosion of how bad it felt. It does not by itself explain why people report actively missing the period, wanting it back, feeling a kind of pull toward it. For that, we need a second mechanism, one that is less about emotional decay and more about active reconstruction. Autobiographical memory, the research consistently shows, is not something closer to played back footage of what happened. It is a reconstruction assembled fresh each time a memory is retrieved, and that reconstruction is shaped heavily by present concerns, present identity, and present goals. Researchers sometimes describe this as memory serving the working self, meaning the version of a person's identity that is currently active and in need of support. This is why the same underlying set of past events can be told in genuinely different ways at different points in a person's life. Not because the person is lying, but because each act of remembering pulls forward different details, gives different weight to different moments, and interprets the whole period through whatever lens the present self happens to need. A person who is currently lonely may find their memory system foregrounding past moments of connection from that period. A person currently uncertain about who they are may find memory foregrounding the ways that difficult chapter gave them a clear sense of identity, even if that identity came bundled with real hardship at the time. This reconstructive quality of memory connects directly to one of the most consistently documented functions of nostalgia, which is that nostalgic recall exists largely to serve a present psychological need for connectedness and continuity, not to provide an accurate replay of history. Across a large and consistent body of research, nostalgic memories reliably foreground certain kinds of content over others. They tend to center on other people rather than isolated personal achievement, on relationships and social bonds specifically, and on the sense that a person's current identity is meaningfully connected to who they were during that earlier period. Researchers have traced a fairly consistent causal pathway through this research. Nostalgic reflection tends to increase a felt sense of social connectedness first. That sense of connectedness then supports something called self continuity, meaning a felt sense that the person one is now is genuinely linked to and grew out of the person one was then, rather than feeling like a stranger to their own past. And that self continuity, in turn, supports what researchers call eudaimonic well being, a form of well being tied to meaning and purpose rather than simple momentary pleasure. This is a meaningfully different story than saying nostalgia is just a rosy filter placed over the past. It suggests nostalgia is doing specific psychological work in the present, using the past as raw material to shore up a person's sense of belonging and identity right now. It is worth being precise about exactly what softens and what does not, because the fading affect bias does not appear to work by erasing the substance of what happened. Research comparing how consistently people recall negative versus neutral events across repeated retellings finds that negative material actually tends to remain more stable, more consistent in its factual content than neutral material does. In other words, memory is not rewriting the basic facts of a hard period into something easier. The layoff still happened, the illness was still frightening, the relationship still had the specific conflicts it had. What changes over repeated remembering is closer to the emotional charge attached to those facts, not the facts themselves, which is part of why this kind of missing does not feel like denial from the inside. A person can accurately remember that a chapter of their life was genuinely hard while simultaneously feeling less wounded by that hardship than they once did, and it is precisely that combination, accurate memory paired with softened pain, that makes room for whatever meaningful identity relevant material sits alongside the difficulty to become the more emotionally prominent part of the recollection. There is a specific narrative pattern connected to this process that researchers studying life stories have identified repeatedly, sometimes called a redemptive narrative, referring to stories in which something that started out bad is eventually reframed as having led somewhere good. People who tend to narrate difficult chapters of their lives this way, as periods that were hard but ultimately generative, tend to score higher on measures of well being, a stronger sense of purpose, and better psychological health more broadly than people whose narratives of the same kind of period stay uniformly negative. This does not mean people are inventing a happy ending that was not really there. It means that autobiographical reasoning, the active process of connecting a past chapter meaningfully to the person someone became afterward, tends to be healthier when it finds some thread of growth or contribution running through the hardship, rather than treating the hardship as simply wasted time, a hard job that taught someone real skill, or a difficult relationship that clarified what they actually wanted going forward fits naturally into this redemptive structure, and that structure itself may be part of what gets carried forward as the period is remembered, alongside the softened pain and the foregrounded social connection already discussed. This helps explain something that otherwise seems strange. Why would a person's memory system selectively highlight the social bonds and identity defining moments from a hard chapter while letting the daily grind of the difficulty itself fade into the background? Because, from the perspective of what memory appears to be for, in this context, the daily grind was never really the point. The daily grind was the surrounding texture, but the social connectedness and identity formation were the substance, and substance is what memory retains most durably when it reconstructs a meaningful period rather than a forgettable one. Research on what people actually retain from important life memories finds a consistent pattern here as well. What survives most reliably are not neutral, evenly weighted details, but specific categories, transitional moments where something in life genuinely changed, memories tied closely to enduring personal themes like trust, identity, intimacy, or a sense of generativity, and memories that connect a person to family, community, or some larger social fabric. A period defined by daily struggle can still be extraordinarily rich in exactly these categories, which is part of why it can end up remembered as meaningful, even formative, despite having been miserable to actually live through day by day. This brings us to a third mechanism, one that operates somewhat independently of both the fading affect bias and nostalgia's social function, and it has to do specifically with identity and loss. A substantial body of research on grief, much of it originally developed to understand mourning after literal bereavement, has been extended in recent years to what researchers call non death loss, meaning the grief people experience over the end of a job, a relationship, a life stage, or a role, even when nobody involved has died. This research consistently finds that what people mourn in these situations is not primarily the objective conditions of the period itself, but the version of themselves that period sustained. A demanding job, however exhausting, often gives a person a clear, legible sense of who they are, a role that organizes their days, defines their competence, and situates them within a community of coworkers or colleagues who recognize and respond to that role. When the job ends, what is lost is not simply a paycheck or a set of daily tasks. It is the entire scaffolding that made that version of the person recognizable, both to others and to themselves. Researchers studying this pattern across very different contexts, including people recovering from serious injury, people navigating chronic illness, and people in demanding occupational roles, keep landing on strikingly similar language. People describe a felt loss of self when the structuring role disappears, sometimes phrased almost as a direct question to themselves about who they are without it. This is not really about missing the specific stress of the period. It is about missing the coherence that period provided, the daily structure, the sense of competence, the social recognition that came from occupying a clear, understood role in relation to other people. A period can be miserable in its texture and still be identity organizing in its structure, and it appears to be the identity organizing quality, not the texture, that gets missed once the period ends. This same structuring function shows up even in situations where the loss is not clean or final, which is instructive because it shows the pattern is not simply about a role ending cleanly and being mourned afterward. Researchers studying what is sometimes called ambiguous loss, situations where someone or something remains physically present but is psychologically or functionally altered or absent, find that this kind of unresolved loss can be even harder to organize a coherent identity around than a clear ending, because the old roles, rules, and rituals that used to structure the relationship can no longer be reliably reconstructed, yet nothing has definitively closed either. People caring for a family member with advancing dementia often describe exactly this kind of disorientation, grieving a version of a loved one who is still alive but no longer fully recognizable in the ways that used to define the relationship. A related pattern shows up in research on people whose work does not come with a stable organizational role at all, such as independent or gig based workers, who often have to actively construct their own sense of structure and belonging out of routines, relationships, and a sense of purpose, precisely because they lack the built in scaffolding that a traditional job or institution normally provides. When those self built connections weaken, the resulting sense of precariousness can feel just as identity threatening as losing a formal role, which suggests the underlying need being served, some coherent, socially anchored structure that makes daily life legible, is more fundamental than any specific job title or relationship label. There is a useful, more philosophically grounded way of understanding why this loss feels so specifically disorienting, drawn from research on grief more broadly. Loss, in this framing, is not simply the removal of a person, a role, or a set of circumstances. It is the collapse of a structure of expectation, meaning the whole framework of practically significant possibilities that previously organized a person's sense of what their days meant and where they were headed. When that structure collapses, whether through the end of a job, the end of a relationship, or the end of any sustained life chapter, the person is left having to build a new structure. And that process of rebuilding, even when the old structure was genuinely difficult to live inside, can leave someone longing for the coherence the old structure provided, independent of whether that old structure was actually pleasant. Grief, understood this way, is reserved specifically for losses that disrupt the underlying structure of someone's life. Ordinary sadness about a bad situation ending does not carry this same weight, but genuine identity organizing structures, even painful ones, apparently do. These three mechanisms, the fading of negative emotion, the reconstructive and identity serving function of nostalgic memory, and the specific grief people feel for a lost, structuring version of themselves, work together rather than competing as separate explanations. The fading effect bias clears away some of the felt weight of the original difficulty. The reconstructive quality of memory then selectively foregrounds the socially meaningful, identity relevant content from that period, because that is the content memory appears designed to preserve most durably. And the loss of the structuring role or relationship generates a genuine grief response, distinct from ordinary sadness, precisely because it collapsed a framework the person had been relying on to make sense of their days. Put these three processes together, and you get something that looks, from the outside, exactly like missing a life a person did not actually enjoy. Not because the person is misremembering the misery necessarily, but because the misery was never the load bearing part of what that period meant to them. And memory, along with grief, is organized around meaning rather than around a faithful, evenly weighted record of daily experience. It would be a mistake, though, to treat all of this as a uniformly comforting story, because the same research that explains this pattern also identifies real limits and real failure modes, and a careful account has to include them. Nostalgic reflection is not universally beneficial, and the research draws a fairly sharp distinction between what happens when nostalgia is deliberately, briefly engaged, the kind studied in controlled experimental settings, and what happens when nostalgic feelings arise spontaneously in the middle of ordinary daily life. In carefully controlled studies, nostalgia reliably produces the benefits already described: increased connectedness, increased meaning, a stronger sense of self continuity. But research tracking people's actual daily experience finds something more complicated. Nostalgic feelings that arise spontaneously during normal daily life are associated with lower well being, not higher, and this effect persists into the following day. Part of the explanation appears to be that deliberately prompted nostalgic recall tends to surface more purely positive material, while spontaneous, everyday nostalgia is more likely to arrive already entangled with regret, longing, or an unfavorable comparison between a valued past and a currently unsatisfying present. That comparison between a fondly remembered past and a present that feels diminished by contrast appears to be the specific tipping point separating helpful nostalgia from something closer to avoidance. When nostalgic reflection helps someone feel more connected to their own continuous identity and, from that place, feel more capable of moving forward, it functions as a resource. But when the same reflection instead deepens a sense that the present is permanently inferior to a past that can never be recovered, it functions as a retreat, something closer to hiding from present difficulty rather than building toward a future. Several factors appear to determine which of these two patterns wins out for a given person. Baseline psychological resilience matters considerably. Research on populations facing significant ongoing hardship, including displaced populations and young people living through prolonged conflict, finds that individuals with higher underlying resilience are able to draw most of nostalgia's typical benefits from remembering better times, largely without the accompanying costs. Individuals with lower resilience facing the same kind of hardship are more likely to experience the opposite effect, with nostalgic reflection actually reducing their sense of optimism, meaning, and self esteem rather than restoring it. Existing psychological vulnerability also matters. People with a tendency toward rumination or those already dealing with depression are more likely to experience nostalgic recall as something closer to dwelling than as something restorative, since rumination and healthy reminiscence can look superficially similar from the outside while functioning very differently underneath. There is also good reason to think the content of what gets remembered matters, not just the act of remembering itself. Periods or memories that carry a genuinely bittersweet quality, tangled up with real loss or unresolved pain alongside whatever was meaningful about them, tend to produce more mixed psychological outcomes than memories that are more purely positive in tone. This fits naturally with everything discussed so far. A difficult chapter of someone's life is, almost by definition, going to generate exactly this kind of bittersweet memory material, full of genuine meaning and identity formation, but also genuinely entangled with real hardship that the fading affect bias may soften without ever fully erasing. That combination is part of why longing for a difficult past can feel so specifically complicated compared to straightforwardly happy nostalgia, carrying both the pull toward connection and coherence, and an undercurrent of something closer to grief that never fully resolves. A further layer of research adds attachment style and what researchers call dispositional fit to this picture of who benefits from nostalgic reflection and who does not. People who score higher on measures of avoidant attachment, meaning a general discomfort with closeness and a tendency to distance themselves emotionally from others, do not appear to receive the same social connectedness benefits from nostalgic reflection that less avoidant individuals do, even when recalling the exact same kind of fond, socially rich memory. This makes sense once you recall that the core mechanism running through most of this research is social connectedness leading to self continuity, leading to well being. If a person's general orientation toward closeness is already guarded, the first link in that chain may simply not activate as strongly, regardless of how meaningful the remembered content is. A related finding comes from a structured, multi week nostalgia intervention in which participants were guided to deliberately engage in nostalgic reflection on a regular basis over several weeks. This intervention improved well being overall, but the improvement was concentrated specifically among people who already had a stronger natural tendency toward nostalgic thinking. Among participants low in this natural tendency, the same intervention produced lower well being rather than higher, a clear demonstration that deliberately prescribing nostalgic reflection is not a universally safe recommendation, and that it interacts with something like a person's baseline relationship to their own past. Cross cultural research adds one further nuance worth mentioning briefly. While the core benefits of nostalgia, increased connectedness, and meaning, replicate quite broadly across a large number of countries and cultural contexts, the size of that effect appears somewhat reduced in less economically developed settings, a finding that has not yet been fully explained but suggests that material and social context likely shapes how available or effective this particular psychological resource is for a given person. One more distinction from this research is worth including because it helps explain why two people can go through the same kind of hard chapter and end up in very different places afterward. Researchers studying how people connect difficult memories to their present sense of self have found that the specific way someone links a past hardship to who they are now matters considerably for their psychological outcome. When a person draws what researchers call a positive self event connection, meaning they interpret the hard period as having contributed something constructive to who they became, such as strength, clarity, or a skill they still rely on, that connection is associated with lower distress and a stronger sense of identity going forward. When a person instead draws a negative self event connection, interpreting the same kind of hardship as evidence of damage, deficiency, or something that permanently diminished them, the outcome tends to be worse, with higher distress and a less stable sense of identity. Both of these are ways of connecting a past chapter to a present self, and both are, in a sense, active interpretive choices rather than neutral facts about what happened. This helps explain why missing a hard chapter is not automatically a sign that someone is doing something wrong or fooling themselves. If the hardship has been woven into a positive self event connection, the resulting nostalgia is likely to be functioning the way this research suggests it usually functions, restoring a sense of continuity and meaning rather than trapping someone in avoidance. This entire body of research also has a practical thread running through it, in the form of structured reminiscence interventions, where people are guided through deliberate, supported reflection on meaningful past experiences, often in a group or therapeutic setting. Reviews of this kind of intervention find that it reliably reduces depressive symptoms and improves life satisfaction among older adults who do not have significant cognitive impairment, which is a useful piece of corroborating evidence for everything discussed so far. If simply guiding someone to reflect more deliberately and specifically on meaningful past experience produces measurable improvements in mood and satisfaction that supports the underlying claim that memory, handled well, is doing genuine psychological work rather than functioning as an accidental distortion that happens to feel nice. It also reinforces the distinction already drawn between guided, intentional remembering and the more haphazard, spontaneous nostalgia that tends to arise unprompted in daily life, since these structured interventions appear to more reliably produce the connectedness and meaning benefits associated with the healthier end of this spectrum. Taken together, this body of research offers a genuinely coherent account of why someone can look back on a period they would never have described as enjoyable while living through it, and still feel a real, specific longing for it once it has ended. Memory is not simply failing to preserve how hard the period was, it is actively softening the emotional weight of that hardship faster than it softens whatever was meaningful, while simultaneously reconstructing the period around the social bonds, identity, and structure that made it matter, because that is the material memory appears built to hold onto most durably. Layered on top of that reconstruction sits a genuine grief response, distinct from ordinary sadness, aimed specifically at the loss of a coherent, legible version of oneself that the period had sustained, whatever the daily texture of that period actually felt like. None of this requires believing the person is fooling themselves or that the difficulty they lived through was secretly enjoyable all along. It requires understanding that memory and identity are organized around meaning, connection, and structure, not around an even, faithful record of daily suffering, and that missing a hard chapter of life is, in a very real sense, missing exactly that, the coherence and connection the chapter provided, carried forward by a memory system that was never really designed to keep the daily misery as vivid as everything else. There is also a biological account of why losing a structuring role or relationship can feel like losing part of oneself rather than simply losing something external. Research on the neuroscience of grief suggests that once a close bond forms, whether a romantic pairing, a close friendship, or even a deeply embedded professional identity, the brain circuitry effectively reorganizes to treat the other person or the role itself as an integrated part of a functioning system rather than as a separate external entity. Under this account, separation is not experienced simply as the absence of something that used to be present. It is experienced as something closer to the subtraction of a working part of the self, which is part of why the disorientation that follows can feel so disproportionate to an outside observer who only sees the external circumstances changing. The bereaved, or the person whose defining role has ended, has to build an updated internal model of themselves that accounts for this absence, a process that takes real time and repeated experience to complete, not simply a cognitive decision to accept that something has changed. This framework helps explain why longing for a lost chapter of life does not resolve the moment a person consciously acknowledges, on an intellectual level, that the chapter is over. The felt sense of missing a piece of oneself can persist well after the rational acceptance has already happened, because the underlying neural reorganization runs on a slower, more experiential timescale. It is also worth noting where this entire system can break down, because the research is not uniformly reassuring, and a fair account should not suggest that everyone eventually arrives at some comfortable, meaning rich version of their difficult past. In depression and in post traumatic stress specifically, autobiographical memory often becomes what researchers call overgeneral, meaning a person loses some of their normal capacity to retrieve specific, vivid, individual episodes, and instead retrieves broad, blurred categories of experience, along with persistently negative interpretations of the self drawn from those categories. In this state, the fading affect bias that normally helps soften painful memories over time is measurably disrupted, and the reconstructive, identity serving version of memory that supports healthy nostalgia does not appear to function the same way either. For someone experiencing this kind of disruption, the process described throughout this episode, softened pain, foregrounded meaning, a coherent, redemptive narrative, does not reliably happen on its own, which is one of several reasons clinicians treating depression and trauma often work directly and specifically with how a person is remembering their own past, rather than assuming healthy memory processes will simply take care of it given enough time. That is Strides to Solutions for this episode. Thank you for listening.